Good morning and good evening, everyone. I'll speak for a few minutes about key findings from Annex 80 policy actions. This is presented on behalf of the entire Annex 80 Subtask D working group. As Peter mentioned a moment ago, the goal of the Annex 80 Resilient Cooling of Buildings, this 20-nation project, is to advance passive and low-energy, low-carbon cooling strategies to make them the mainstream and preferred solutions for cooling and overheating in buildings. You can see at right a map of the countries. I believe we have about 16 participant countries and 4 interested party nations. Subtask D within the Annex promotes cooling policies that boost resilience to 2 disruptions, heat waves and power outages, which, as you know from the news today, can be quite a big deal. The approach of the policy action subtask is to collect, review, and compare existing policies, and then from what we learn, prepare recommendations. Over the 4-year course of the Annex, we began with policy collection. We proceeded to then review and compare these policies. We're in the process now of generating recommendations, and over the remainder of the Annex, we'll be writing them up in a way that I'll describe in a few minutes. We learned early on that there are simply too many building energy efficiency policies around the globe for our team, as good as the team is, to assess all of them. And just to give you an example, if you use only the IEA's policies database and you filter for buildings and energy efficiency, that alone turns up nearly 1,700 policies. If you get a little more specific and limit the building energy efficiency policies to those relating to heating and cooling, you still have 563 policies just from this one database alone. So we realized that trying to review every policy in the world would not work very well for us. Instead, 24 researchers in the Annex from 12 institutions examined policies from 19 regions, mostly to find opportunities. I show here another map of the regions in which we searched for policies that would relate to resilient cooling. In our quest, we considered 8 types of policies that could be relevant. Building energy efficiency standards, green building standards, model codes, which could be for building energy efficiency or for green buildings, green building certification programs such as LEED from the US Green Building Council, financial incentive programs, for example, utility rebates, laws, statutes, or regulations. Some cities, for example, have gone beyond code and require certain things for cooling. Extreme heat plans. Many cities and states, and in fact nations, have developed what to do in the case of an extreme heat event. And disclosures, which is a fancy way of talking about things like product certification programs. We collected policies for a wide variety of strategies. In the Annex, we have grouped resilient cooling technologies, which we also sometimes call resilient cooling strategies, because some approaches are really what you do rather than a particular device for doing it. For example, opening a window to provide natural ventilation is more of a strategy than a technology. Well, we have 4 groups. The first group would be those cooling strategies that reduce heat gain, for example, a cool surface on a building. The second would be those that remove sensible heat, for example, through ventilative cooling. The third would be those that enhance personal comfort, for example, a fan in a room. And the fourth would be those that remove latent heat. We also reviewed whole building performance policies. And you can see here the list and pictures of the wide variety of resilient cooling strategies that we examined. I've struck through two of them, one for absorption refrigeration and the other for high performance dehumidification, simply because when we reviewed policies, we did not review policies for those two. In the end, we reviewed 202 policy resources across 12 resilient cooling technologies to find the strengths, the weaknesses, and the opportunities in those policies. The distribution is shown here. The four that were most popular, so to speak, in the sense of being most reviewed, were advanced solar shading and advanced glazing as grouped together. That means windows and shading. Then cool envelope materials, cool roofs, cool walls. And then equal together heat storage and release. That's a fancy way of saying thermal mass. And then adiabatic and evaporative cooling. We did, of course, look at the others that are shown here. As we collected the policies, we populated a database that described each policy. This would make it easier for us to later compare and analyze the policies. I show here a list of the fields. Don't worry, there will not be a quiz. After we populated the database, we had entries that looked something like this. And so you can imagine that there's 200 plus columns worth of information describing these policies with some rather detailed notes. And that is our policy assessment framework document. Starting from that, we then prepared a substantial policy analysis report that summarizes the existing policies and policy opportunities. Within that report, we discuss the types of policies relevant to resilient cooling. I showed you the 8 earlier. Explain how we did this. We then review the policies that are relevant to each resilient cooling strategy, as well as whole building policies. For whole building policy, think about something that governs the performance of a building. Within that work, we identified the strengths and weaknesses, and we've identified the opportunities for policies, perhaps learning from what was done in certain parts of the world or observing where there were gaps. Among the 70 plus ideas, I've provided here a few examples spanning a variety of different resilient cooling strategies. For example, for shading, one of the recommendations was to provide some guidance to support the uptake of shading technologies, highlighting good practices. For ventilated envelopes, one was to make the various ventilated envelopes better for dealing with extreme climates. And this particular recommendation more has to do with the process for how the use of ventilated envelopes is followed and rewarded. For another few examples, in the cool roof area, there are a variety of policies and programs that already recognize the merits of cool roofs. They could just as well reward the use of cool walls if you account for differences in materials and physics. In the whole building area, one of the recurring themes is to look at whole building performance not just in a typical meteorological year, but also, as is very important to this particular annex of the IEA, to account for extreme events such as heat waves and power outages, and to look more generally at what happens in future climates, which is something that the Annex has in its technical branches studied at some length. And then there are further examples for evaporative cooling. There should be national standards that are specific to different types of evaporative cooling technologies. And for indoor air movement, by which you should read fans, these should be credited in building energy standards, such as ASHRAE 90.1. And these are only half a dozen examples out of the 70 plus, but it gives you a flavor of the sorts of ideas that were generated. Now, each idea has been tagged with the mechanism that would be used to implement it. So, for example, are we talking about regulation or information, meaning things like education? Is this research and development opportunity to promote an emerging technology or to demonstrate an existing technology? Are we talking about enhancing standards, incorporating key performance indices that are specific to resilient cooling and the types of disruptions that we are trying to address? Or perhaps it's about introducing extreme heat weather files to replace typical meteorological years. Or maybe we're talking about incentives, whether it's something like a rebate to a consumer or perhaps a competition that will drive the emergence of the suitable resilient cooling technology. We noted as we are classifying these ideas other characteristics, such as where each idea could be applied and how long it would take to implement. So some of these ideas are technology specific, for example, something related to evaporative roofs, and some are technology agnostic, meaning that they relate to whole building performance and don't identify a particular technology. And then, of course, you have the application, new buildings, existing buildings, building operations, a qualitative idea of the timeline, short, medium, or long, geography, where would this be relevant, cost, very qualitative in this particular project, low, medium, high, and does the policy provide resilience to the disruptions about which we care. This fall, we'll generate a one-page summary of each policy recommendation that the Annex wishes to pursue, and this will be an expansion of the sorts of information that I described a few moments ago. And then the technology assessments from other branches of the Annex and the policy recommendations will be shared with interested organizations. The Annex 80 products are to support resilient cooling campaigns and policy efforts, and the sorts of products that would be shared include things like technology profiles, which are compact descriptions of cooling strategies and their benefits, case studies, which will be described in just a few moments by some of my colleagues, and the policy recommendations that I've been describing. And a few of the organizations that are awaiting some of our input are the Cool Coalition, Sustainable Energy for All, and the Kigali Cooling Efficiency Program. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and I will turn things over to Dahai and to Gerhard, who will talk about, they'll present an overview of Annex 80 field studies.